In the heart of the galaxy, the Union stood tall as a beacon of peace. It was an alliance of countless species, each with its own traditions, strengths, and weaknesses. The Zorathians were giants, their muscle unmatched, built for war. The Talirians, with their sharp minds, had mastered technology beyond comprehension. The Karians were the heart of the Union, resilient and unyielding. And then there was humanity. A young species, Earth barely more than a flicker in the vastness of the stars. Humanity had earned its place in the Union, but not by might or technology. They had earned it through their perseverance, through their endless drive to overcome. They weren't the strongest. They weren't the smartest. But they were stubborn, relentless, and willing to sacrifice everything for their survival. For centuries, humanity had been forced into the shadows, watching as the galaxy's great powers ruled over them. But they had always waited patiently. They had been the underdogs, the outsiders. Time and time again, they had shown restraint, holding their tongues when others mocked them, biting their lips when others dismissed them. They had watched others rise and fall. But humanity had learned to survive. And it was in their survival that the galaxy's greatest mistake had been made. They had forgotten that humanity's forbearance had its limits. The galaxy was on the brink of another war, but this time it wasn't an outside force threatening to tear it apart. This time it was the Union itself, the very organization humanity had fought so hard to be a part of. Political tensions within the Union had reached a boiling point. A world, Orestes, a planet rich in resources, was on the verge of collapse. The Orestians had long been oppressed by their government, controlled by a tyrannical regime that used the planet's wealth to fuel their own power. The people had suffered in silence, fighting for change, but always with one hand tied behind their backs. And now, finally, they had had enough. The rebellion on Orestes was swift, violent, and desperate. The Orestians, with their backs against the wall, had risen up. They had fought for their independence, their freedom from the oppressive regime. And they had done it with what little they had, with courage, with fire, and with the determination to survive. The Union, bound by its rules of non-interference, had hesitated. They had sent humanitarian aid, of course, but that wasn't enough. The Orestians needed more. They needed someone to take a stand for them. And humanity, despite all their previous years of silence, had made their choice. They would be the ones to act. Juno Albright, a human officer with the Union's peacekeeping fleet, stood before her team in the briefing room. The mission was simple: intervene. The Union had authorized a limited military action to stabilize the situation on Orestes, but Juno knew that this wasn't about stability anymore. This was about making sure the Orestians got the future they deserved. As she looked around at the faces of her fellow officers, Juno could see the doubt in their eyes. They had all been taught the same things: that the Union was the highest authority, that their orders were sacred, and that it was their duty to uphold peace at all costs. But Juno had spent too much time watching the galaxy ignore humanity's voice. And now, for the first time, she was ready to break that silence. "This isn't about just restoring order," Juno said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "This is about doing what's right. If the Union won't act, we will. We're not going to let this planet burn just because the Union's too afraid to take a stand." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Juno's decision had been made. The human fleet was going to Orestes, with or without the Union's approval. The journey to Orestes was long, and with each passing hour, the weight of what they were about to do pressed down harder on Juno. Humanity had always stood by the Union's side, fighting their wars, assisting their peacekeeping missions. But now, the time had come for humanity to take control of its destiny. Juno could feel the anger, the frustration, the years of being held back. She was no longer just a soldier. She was a symbol of humanity's refusal to be silenced. As their fleet entered Orestes' orbit, Juno received the transmission she had been expecting. The Union Council, a group of individuals who represented the various species, had sent a message. The message was short, direct, and unmistakably clear: "Stand down." "We can't stand down," Juno said quietly to her crew. "Not this time." The command was given. The human fleet descended onto the planet's surface, engaging with the rebel forces. The Union's objections were ignored. The people of Orestes were fighting for freedom, and humanity was not going to stand by while they were crushed. The battle was fierce, but humanity's resolve was even fiercer. The Union's fleets, hesitant and uncertain, arrived too late. They tried to intervene to stop the human-led forces from taking action, but the galaxy's greatest powers underestimated what humanity was capable of. They had always thought humanity would be passive, compliant. They had always thought humanity would follow orders without question. But on Orestes, humanity showed them something different. The battle raged for hours, but by the end of the day, humanity had succeeded. The tyrannical government was overthrown, and the people of Orestes were free. Juno stood at the front of her ship, watching as the Orestians cheered in the streets below. But as the cheers echoed through the atmosphere, something deeper burned within Juno. They had done it. They had made a stand. And in that moment, she knew the galaxy would never be the same again. Humanity's forbearance had snapped, and the galaxy would never forget the day that humanity stopped waiting. The dust of Orestes hadn't even begun to settle before the galaxy's reaction was clear. In the vast halls of the Union Council, a meeting was called. Delegates from dozens of worlds arrived, their faces a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and a palpable fear. Humanity's actions on Orestes had rocked the foundation of the Union. The power of the galaxy had been shaken, and for the first time in centuries, the Union's long-standing rule of non-intervention was being questioned. Humanity had broken the rules, and no one knew what that would mean for the future. Juno Albright stood before a council that was now filled with wary eyes. She had heard the whispers of her crew, of her fellow humans, and of the other species. They had done what they set out to do, freed the Orestians from their oppression. But the price for that freedom had been high, and the consequences were yet to be fully understood. Her actions had made her a hero in the eyes of many Orestians, but to the Union, she was a rogue officer, a symbol of disobedience, and a threat to the carefully structured order they had spent millennia creating. The Union had issued an ultimatum: stand down or face the consequences, but humanity was no longer willing to kneel. The Union Council's grand chamber was tense, the air thick with silence. Juno stepped into the center of the room, her uniform sharp and her posture unyielding. The faces before her were varied: the towering Zorathians, the sleek Talirians, the Carians, whose features were half hidden in their shadowed hoods, all watching her with eyes filled with judgment and suspicion. Chancellor Velthar, the imposing Zorathian leader who had once stood against humanity's entry into the Union, was the first to speak. "Cadet Albright," he began, his voice as heavy as the metal of his armor, "you have put us all in a precarious position. By acting without the Council's approval, you've shown a blatant disregard for the very rules we've established to maintain order in this galaxy. This is not how we operate." His gaze burned through her. "And yet, you claim that you acted for the greater good. Tell me, human, do you even understand the consequences of your actions?" Juno held her ground, the weight of the galaxy's judgment pressing on her. But her voice was steady, her eyes unwavering. "I understand perfectly, Chancellor," Juno replied, her voice firm and clear. "The Orestians were oppressed and the Union hesitated while they bled. I acted because the Union was too paralyzed to do anything. I didn't break the rules for my own gain. I did it because sometimes the rules need to be broken to make things right." Her gaze swept over the council. "Humanity is not afraid to take risks. We've fought for survival in ways you can't begin to understand. We will fight for what's right, whether you approve of it or not." The room fell silent. The galaxy's leaders stared at her, each processing her words in their own way. Some faces were filled with anger, others with disbelief, but none of them could deny the truth of what she said. Humanity had acted, and it had been decisive. The rebellion on Orestes was not just a battle for independence. It was the first time humanity had stepped out from the shadows and into the light. The council deliberated for hours, the fate of humanity hanging in the balance. The discussions were heated, with some arguing for humanity's expulsion from the Union, while others saw Juno's actions as a necessary catalyst for change. But no matter where they stood, they couldn't ignore the fact that humanity had taken a stand, and that could not be undone. Juno stood outside the council chamber, her hands clasped behind her back, her mind racing. She could feel the eyes of the galaxy on her now. If humanity was to continue, if they were to have a future in the galaxy, they would need to prove themselves in ways no one had ever expected. She wasn't just fighting for the Arrestians anymore. She was fighting for humanity's right to lead, to make a difference. They had been overlooked for too long, and now they had shown the galaxy what they were capable of. Finally, the Council's decision was made. The Union's leaders would not expel humanity, but they would impose strict conditions. Humanity would be closely monitored, its actions under constant scrutiny. The Council could no longer allow the kind of rogue operation that had taken place on Orestes, but they would offer humanity the chance to prove itself. They were given one last warning. Humanity had to prove that it could lead without causing chaos, that it could respect the Union's structure while still fighting for what was right. The message was clear: humanity was on probation. Juno walked out of the chamber, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. She had won the battle for Orestes, but she knew that this was just the beginning. The Union had agreed to keep humanity in the fold, but now humanity would have to work harder than ever to prove they belonged. Every step forward would be watched, every decision questioned. Humanity had earned a seat at the table, but they hadn't yet earned trust. The war for humanity's place in the galaxy was not over. Back on Orestes, the people celebrated their newfound freedom. They had been given the chance to rebuild, to forge their own future. Humanity had helped them achieve that, and they would never forget the debt they owed. But even as the celebrations raged on, Juno knew the work was far from over. She stood alone in the quiet of her quarters, looking out at the stars, knowing that everything had changed. Humanity had broken their silence. They had refused to sit idly by while others suffered. But as she gazed into the endless void, she understood the truth. The galaxy would never forget the day humanity's forbearance snapped. And neither would she. The galaxy had taken notice, not just of the Arrestian victory, but of what humanity represented. For too long they had been the quiet ones, the species that did the dirty work, kept the peace, and picked up the pieces after others tore things apart. But now humanity had proven something fundamental. They weren't just survivors, they were fighters. And their fight wasn't just for themselves anymore. It was for everyone who had been overlooked, for everyone who had been left in the shadows. But that recognition didn't come without consequences. Juno Albright stood at the head of the human delegation as the Union's representatives sent their orders through. Humanity had been given a chance to prove themselves, but the galaxy was watching with skepticism. Even after the Arrestian victory, even after humanity had laid it all on the line, the Union still questioned their place in the galaxy. And that was the crux of the problem. The Union had been built on a foundation of power, control, and order. They believed in treaties and negotiations, in discussions and deliberations. But humanity had shown something different, something they hadn't expected. They had shown the galaxy that sometimes it wasn't enough to sit back and wait for things to happen. Sometimes you had to take action, even if it meant breaking the rules. And that made the galaxy nervous. Back on Earth, the news spread like wildfire. Humanity's victory on Orestes wasn't just about a rebellion, it was a statement. It was humanity saying, "We are here and we are ready to lead." But as Juno and her crew received the transmission from the Union, they knew what was coming. Humanity's place in the galaxy was not secure. They had been allowed to stay in the Union, but with conditions. The Council had issued a clear ultimatum: prove that humanity could be trusted to handle power without causing chaos. "Cadet Albright," the message from Union Command began, "your actions on Orestes have not gone unnoticed. While we acknowledge the success of the mission, The methods used will not be tolerated moving forward. You will adhere to the Union's guidelines. Any further rogue actions will be met with consequences. Humanity will not be allowed to act on its own without the approval of the Union. Juno sighed as she looked at the screen. This wasn't a warning. It was a threat. A reminder that humanity, despite all its achievements, was still a newcomer to the galaxy. The message was clear. You can play in the galaxy, but only as long as you follow the rules. Juno closed the communication, her mind racing. She had known the price of defiance, but she hadn't expected it to come so soon. Humanity had made their mark on the galaxy, but they had also angered the Union. The path forward was uncertain, and Juno wasn't sure whether the Union would accept humanity's newfound strength or continue to see them as a potential threat. The next few weeks were tense. The Union's higher-ups moved cautiously, their political games more visible than ever. Each decision seemed to be a test, and humanity was failing most of them. The Council made it clear that humanity's actions on arrestees were seen as an embarrassment to the Union. They were forced to walk a fine line, pretending to follow the rules while secretly resenting the limitations placed on them. But Juno wasn't about to let that stop her. She had seen what humanity was capable of, and she knew that if they played by the Union's rules, they would remain in the shadows forever. That's when the next mission came through. A diplomatic crisis had erupted on the planet Viroth, a border world that had been torn apart by political corruption and a rising rebellion. The Union had sent multiple delegations to negotiate peace, but none had succeeded. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and the Union was losing control. This was supposed to be a peacekeeping mission, but everyone knew that it was just a matter of time before the conflict spiraled out of control. The Union's answer: send in a small, non-threatening human task force to handle it. It was clear to Juno what they were doing. The Union didn't want to risk further embarrassment, so they had assigned humanity a simple mission, a way to keep them busy while the Union handled the real politics behind the scenes. But Juno knew better. She had seen this before. Humanity was being treated like a tool, a pawn to be used in the background while the galaxy's power players made their moves. And Juno couldn't let that happen. The Viroth mission was supposed to be a small-scale operation, a simple assignment. The Union had already sent diplomatic teams to the planet, but they were blocked by the entrenched political factions. Viroth was on the verge of war, and the Union needed results now. Juno had been given command of the mission, but she wasn't interested in playing by the Union's rules this time. She had her own plan. The task force under her command was small but well-trained. They were humans, and they knew how to fight, but more importantly, they knew how to bring people together. This wasn't just about stopping the fighting. This was about ending the cycle of control that the Union and the other powers had imposed on the galaxy. Humanity was going to show that it didn't just follow orders, it created a new way forward. It wasn't enough to stop the fighting. They needed to show the galaxy a new path. Juno called her team to a briefing. "We're not going to play their game," she said, her voice firm. "The Union may want to negotiate, but we're going to show them that we can do more than talk. We're going to help the people of Viroth take back their world. We're going to show the galaxy that humanity isn't just here to follow the rules. We're here to change the game." Her officers nodded, their faces set with determination. They had seen what humanity was capable of, and now they were ready to prove it to the galaxy. The mission on Viroth was more intense than anyone had expected. The factions fighting for control were powerful and entrenched, and the stakes were high. But Juno and her team worked tirelessly, leveraging every resource, every connection, and every ounce of human ingenuity to bring the various factions to the table. They didn't just stop the fighting. They built coalitions, brokered deals, and slowly, piece by piece, they began to pull Viroth back from the brink. For the first time, humanity was not just cleaning up the mess. They were making the decisions. They were leading. And the galaxy began to notice. By the time the mission ended, Viroth was on the road to recovery. The peace wasn't perfect, but it was real. The factions had agreed to a ceasefire, and the Union had been forced to admit that humanity had accomplished what they could not. The galaxy's leaders were left with a stark choice: adapt or be left behind. Humanity had shown them that sometimes, to save the galaxy, you had to be willing to act without waiting for permission. Juno stood before her crew, looking at the horizon of Viroth as the sun set. The mission had been a success, but she knew there was still so much more to do. Humanity's place in the galaxy was no longer in question. They had shown that when it mattered most, humanity would rise. And from that moment on, no species would ever forget the day humanity's forbearance snapped. The aftermath of the Viroth mission left the galaxy buzzing. Humanity had done it again. In a situation where the Union's power had faltered, a small human task force had turned the tide. The factions on Viroth had been brought to the negotiating table, a fragile peace established, and the Union had been forced to concede that it was humanity who had taken the lead. But as the weeks passed, a troubling thought lingered in Juno's mind. The Union might have reluctantly acknowledged humanity's growing strength, but that didn't mean they were ready to trust them. The power dynamics in the galaxy were shifting, and the Union had always been a cautious, slow-moving behemoth. Humanity's methods, brash and decisive, didn't fit the Union's delicate balance of diplomacy. And there was something else, something deeper. The Union had been forced to deal with humanity, but they weren't done testing their resolve. The galaxy was watching, and Juno knew that humanity's place wasn't as secure as it seemed. Not yet. A few days after the Viroth mission ended, Juno received a transmission from Union Command. The message was brief but clear. The Union had decided to test humanity's commitment to peace in the galaxy. There was another crisis brewing, one that involved a planet in a neighboring system, Haldara, where tensions had been rising for years. Haldara had been a peaceful world, but recently, internal conflict had threatened to spiral into all-out war. Several factions were vying for control, and the Union needed to intervene to stabilize the situation. Juno was ordered to take command of a joint task force, but this time, the Union had chosen not to trust humanity with the full responsibility. They insisted on a larger coalition of Union forces, with humanity's role relegated to a supporting one. They would be part of the mission, but not the leaders. Once again, humanity had been sidelined. The message sent a sharp wave of frustration through Juno. She had expected this, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. They had proven themselves on Orestes. They had proven themselves on Viroth. Yet the Union still saw them as the young species, the one that couldn't be trusted to lead. But Juno wasn't about to back down. She wasn't going to let humanity's hard-earned position in the galaxy be dictated by the Union's outdated thinking. It was time to show them that humanity was more than capable of handling the weight of leadership, even if they didn't want to acknowledge it. When they arrived at Haldara, the situation was more dire than Juno had anticipated. The planet was on the brink of destruction, its cities torn apart by skirmishes between rival factions. The Union forces, despite their numbers and advanced technology, had been unable to make any headway. The peacekeepers were being pushed back by a relentless insurgency. Juno's task force arrived in orbit, with Union ships already engaged in battle with insurgent forces on the ground. But Juno had a different plan. She wasn't here to play second fiddle. Humanity would take the lead this time, and she would make sure they did it the right way. "Marcus," Juno said, turning to her right-hand officer, Lieutenant Lee, "we're going to lead this one. No more waiting around for the Union to make decisions. We take control." Marcus looked at her, unsure at first. "You think they'll let us, after everything?" "They don't have a choice," Juno replied, determination in her voice. "We've shown them what we're capable of. Now we do it again, for humanity and for the people of Haldara." As the team descended to the planet's surface, they were met with a chaotic scene. The city of Vorth, the largest on Haldara, was under heavy assault. The Union peacekeepers were fighting a losing battle, Their forces spread thin across the city, with insurgent groups controlling the high ground and firing from the rooftops. Humanity's task force immediately took charge. Juno ordered a tactical shift, directing her team to secure key infrastructure while the Union forces were given backup support. It wasn't a popular decision, but it was the right one. The insurgents didn't stand a chance against the combined might of humanity's ingenuity and the Union's firepower. The battle was fierce, but Juno's team had one thing the others didn't: the ability to think on their feet. While the Union stuck to traditional tactics, Juno used the terrain, the urban environment, to her advantage. She knew how to outmaneuver the enemy, how to use their own strengths against them. After hours of fighting, the city's insurgent stronghold fell. The Union forces watched as humanity's task force led the charge, coordinating with the local population to restore order. The insurgents surrendered, their morale broken. Haldara had been saved. But the victory felt hollow. The Union, though they had been forced to admit humanity's effectiveness, were still reluctant to give them credit. Juno stood on the surface of Haldara, looking at the skyline in the distance. The city was scarred but alive. The people of Haldara would rebuild, and humanity would continue to fight for them, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the galaxy wasn't done testing them. Back on their flagship, the human delegation awaited the Union's official statement. Juno sat in silence as the transmission began. Cadet Albright, Chancellor Velthar began, his tone unchanged from their previous meeting. While the mission on Haldara was successful, it is clear that humanity still has much to learn in terms of coordination with Union forces. The tactics employed were unorthodox. We will review the details and make recommendations for future operations. Juno clenched her fists but kept her face neutral. They hadn't even acknowledged the victory, let alone given humanity credit for leading it. Chancellor, she said, cutting through the transmission with calm authority, humanity is not here to follow orders. We are here to lead. We have earned that right. If you cannot see that, then maybe it's time for humanity to take a step back from the Union, because we will never stop fighting for what's right, whether the galaxy approves or not. The transmission ended abruptly. The message was clear. Humanity was no longer just a part of the Union. They were a force to be reckoned with. As the fleet moved away from Haldara, Juno stood on the bridge, her eyes set on the stars. The battle for humanity's place in the galaxy wasn't over. It never would be. But one thing was certain. Humanity had shown the galaxy that it would no longer be ignored. The price of defiance had been high, but the cost of submission would be even greater. The galaxy would never forget the day humanity's forbearance snapped. The galaxy had always looked at humanity as the underdog, but no longer. After the victories on Orestes and Viroth, and the recent triumph on Haldara, humanity had proved that they weren't just survivors, they were leaders. The Union had been forced to acknowledge humanity's strength, but that acknowledgement came at a price. The once quiet species was now a powerful force, and their boldness was shaking the foundations of the galaxy. Juno Albright had known the cost of defiance when she had made her stand on Orestes, but she hadn't anticipated the consequences that came after. The galaxy was watching now, and there was no going back. Humanity had proven that it would no longer sit idly by while the rest of the galaxy acted, but the political fallout was immediate, and it was far from kind. After the events on Haldara, the Union's political machine began to churn. While the peacekeepers on the ground had supported humanity's decision, the Union's leaders, particularly the elder species, were not pleased. There were murmurs of rebellion within the ranks, whispers of a divided Union. The galaxy's powerful species had always been the ones to make decisions. Humanity, with its brash and unpredictable methods, had upended everything. Now, they had to decide how to deal with the rise of the human threat. The council called for an emergency session. Juno stood before them once again, but this time her heart wasn't just heavy with the weight of the mission. She could feel the judgment in the air. The Union was no longer an ally. It was a battleground, one where humanity had to fight to maintain their place. Cadet Albright, Chancellor Velthar's voice rang out, commanding the room. You have defied our orders, bent our rules to your will, and with it, you have thrown the Union into disarray. You have made it clear that you will not be controlled. This cannot continue. We cannot allow this to spread. Juno's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. The faces of the galaxy's leaders stared down at her, some full of disdain, others barely masked fear. She could see the cracks in the Union's foundation, cracks they were now trying to fill with condemnation. We did what was necessary, Juno said, her voice steady but firm. Humanity acted because no one else did. The people of Orestes needed us and the people of Viroth needed us. We didn't ask for permission. We took responsibility. Velthar's eyes narrowed. And that, cadet, is exactly why you and your people are dangerous. The Union was built on peace, on consensus. You cannot simply ignore the rules because you believe your way is right. Juno met his gaze without hesitation. If the rules are built on inaction, then maybe they need to be changed. The room fell silent. She had spoken the truth, but in doing so she had sealed her fate. The Union was terrified of what humanity represented, unpredictability. To them, the galaxy ran on order, on laws that had stood for eons. Humanity was a disruptor, and to the Union that was the gravest threat of all. Days later, Juno received a message from the highest levels of Union command. She was summoned to a private meeting. The tension in her chest grew. She had already known this was coming. The Union wasn't just angry with her actions. They were now questioning humanity's place in the galaxy. As she entered the meeting room, she was greeted not just by the council, but by military leaders as well. The atmosphere was suffocating. Velthar stood at the center, flanked by the most powerful officers in the galaxy. Cadet Albright, Velthar began, it is time we address the consequences of your actions. You have shown that humanity can no longer be trusted to follow the rules of the Union. You have forced our hand, and now we must decide if humanity's place in this alliance is secure. Juno's heart raced, but her expression remained calm. I don't need the Union's permission to act. Humanity has always fought for what's right, and we will continue to do so, regardless of how you choose to treat us. Velthar stepped forward. That, cadet, is the problem. You've shown the galaxy that you are willing to risk everything, your place in the Union, your alliances, your own survival for a cause. What happens when you act outside of the galaxy's established laws again? What happens when your people decide to defy us once more? Juno stood tall, her voice unwavering. Then we will be who we are meant to be. We will stand for those who can't stand for themselves. We will rise when the galaxy falters, and we will lead. A deep silence settled over the room, a silence that seemed to echo throughout the chamber. The council, the military leaders, all stared at her, uncertain of what to make of her defiance. But Juno knew one thing for certain. Humanity's place wasn't decided by the Union's laws. It was decided by the choices they made. And humanity would continue to make those choices, even if the galaxy didn't approve. Back on Earth, the news had spread like wildfire. Humanity's actions on Orestes, Viroth, and now Haldara had forced the galaxy to pay attention. They were no longer the overlooked species. They were the bold, defiant force that couldn't be ignored. Some saw them as heroes, others as a growing threat. But no one could deny what they had accomplished. Juno sat in the quiet of her quarters, watching the stars through the ship's viewport. The Union had made it clear. Humanity was walking a dangerous line. They were seen as unpredictable, even dangerous. But in her heart, Juno knew the truth. The galaxy had forgotten something crucial. Humanity had always fought for what was right, and they had never been afraid to break the rules when it mattered. Humanity wasn't here to follow orders. They were here to change the galaxy. In the coming weeks, the Union's political machine moved to isolate humanity. They would continue to be part of the Union, but under strict supervision. The galaxy was now watching, and humanity's next steps would be under the microscope. Juno had expected this, but what she didn't expect was the overwhelming number of species that stood with humanity. The Carians, the Talirians, even the Zorathians had begun to speak in favor of humanity's right to lead. They had seen what humanity could do when they were pushed to their limits. They had seen what humanity could accomplish when they took a stand. And slowly, the balance began to shift. Juno stood before her crew once more, a sense of determination in her eyes. The Union may think they can control us, but they can't. We have shown the galaxy who we are, and now we will show them what humanity is truly capable of. The future of humanity was no longer uncertain. It was just beginning, and no species, not even the Union, would ever forget the day humanity's forbearance snapped. The galaxy had always moved slowly, like a massive, unwieldy ship cutting through the cosmos. Decisions were made in the corridors of power, among the elite leaders who sat on high thrones, untouched by the lives of those below. But humanity had made its mark, disrupting that slow-moving order. They had defied the galaxy's greatest powers, shown that when pushed to the brink, humanity could break free of its constraints and act. And now, the galaxy was changing. Juno Albright had felt the shift. After the Viroth mission and their actions on Haldara, humanity had finally broken free of the shadows. The Union had tried to rein them in, to make them conform to the old ways, but humanity wasn't here to play by those rules. They weren't just part of the galaxy anymore. They were becoming a force in their own right. It was both thrilling and terrifying, and no one knew what would happen next. The question now was simple. Could humanity handle the responsibility of leading? Juno sat in her quarters, staring out at the stars. The ship was in transit, heading back to the Union's headquarters. After the events of Haldara, the political fallout had been swift and severe. Some species had applauded humanity's actions, seeing them as a necessary wake-up call. Others, however, saw it as a dangerous precedent. The Union had imposed heavy sanctions on humanity, suspending them from certain key positions in galactic peacekeeping operations. Humanity's place at the table had been questioned once again. But there was something else stirring beneath the surface. A new movement had begun among the other species. The Carians, long regarded as the stalwart defenders of peace, had quietly voiced support for humanity's boldness. The Talirians, with their calculating minds, had begun to send subtle signals that they believed humanity could be a valuable ally. Even the Zorathians, once the harshest critics of humanity's unpredictability, had begun to shift in their attitudes. The galaxy was changing, and humanity was at the center of it. But Juno knew that change came with its own risks. Leadership would require more than just proving they could take action. It would take wisdom, patience, and the ability to balance power with diplomacy. Juno stood up from her desk and walked to the communications terminal. She sent a message to Lieutenant Marcus Lee, her closest ally, knowing that this conversation would shape the future of humanity. "Marcus," she began when he appeared on the screen, "the galaxy is starting to recognize what we've done, but now we face an even bigger challenge. How do we lead when the galaxy still doesn't trust us fully?" Marcus's face appeared solemn. "You knew this was coming, Juno. The Union might be scared of us, but they can't ignore what we've done. The truth is, some species are starting to see us as a threat. The way we acted, it broke the status quo. The Council may have punished us, but they also can't deny our effectiveness." Juno nodded. She knew Marcus was right. The galaxy had lived in the shadow of peacekeepers and diplomats, where every decision was made carefully, cautiously, with an eye on long-term stability. But humanity had shown that sometimes peace needed to be forced, not negotiated, and that hadn't made the galaxy's leaders happy. "We can't stop now," Juno said, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. "The galaxy is changing and humanity has to be part of it, but we need to show them that we can handle this, that we can lead without causing chaos." Marcus leaned forward, his face filled with concern. How How do we show them that we can be trusted with leadership when everything we've done so far has only made them afraid of us? I don't know yet, Juno admitted, but we're going to figure it out together. As the days passed, Juno and her team began to prepare for the next phase. The Union had decided to send a delegation to a critical summit on the planet Orionis, a world known for its neutrality in galactic politics. The summit was meant to address the growing tension between the Union and the newly formed rebel factions across the galaxy. The Union's leadership needed to send a clear message to the galaxy that they were still in control. But humanity saw the summit as their chance to prove that they could lead not just with force, but with wisdom. Juno was appointed as humanity's representative at the summit, and she knew this would be the defining moment. The galaxy's opinion of humanity would be made or broken here. She was prepared for what lay ahead. But deep down, she couldn't help but wonder, could humanity truly be the leaders the galaxy needed? Or would they be torn apart by the very forces that had held them down for so long? As Juno walked onto the platform at the summit on Orionis, the weight of the moment settled heavily on her shoulders. She stood before the assembly, her eyes scanning the room. The galaxy's leaders were all here, the most powerful and influential species in the universe. They watched her closely, waiting for her next move. Chancellor Velthar, as always, was the first to speak. "Cadet Albright," he began, his tone more neutral than before but still filled with skepticism. "Humanity has made its mark on this galaxy, but your methods, the way you act without permission, without regard for the rules, it is clear that you are no longer just an ally. You are becoming a force that cannot be ignored." Juno stood tall, her voice steady as she addressed the room. "Humanity will never act out of selfishness. We will never act out of greed. We will act for those who cannot. And if the galaxy is afraid of us, it is because we have shown that we are willing to fight for what is right, even when no one else will." The room was silent for a moment. Then, surprisingly, the Carians, who had been silent throughout the proceedings, stepped forward. Their leader, tall and solemn, spoke. "Humanity has done what we could not," the Carian leader said, his voice deep. "You have shown us that peace cannot always be negotiated. Sometimes it must be fought for. We are not afraid of you, Juno Albright. We respect you." The murmurs of approval rippled through the room. Juno felt a surge of hope. The galaxy was beginning to change slowly, but it was changing. The summit ended with humanity's place in the galaxy now more secure than ever. The Union had reluctantly accepted humanity's new role, and some of the most powerful species had begun to ally themselves with humanity, acknowledging their strength and resolve. Juno left the summit with a sense of quiet determination. Humanity had shown the galaxy what they could do. They had broken the chains that bound them to the shadows, and now they were rising to the challenge of leadership. It wasn't going to be easy. The galaxy wasn't going to trust them overnight. But humanity had earned the right to lead, and they wouldn't stop until they proved that their place at the table was not just earned, it was deserved. The stars outside her ship's viewport seemed brighter now. The journey was far from over, but humanity had shown that they would never again be content to sit in silence. The galaxy had forgotten that for too long, but now no species would ever forget the day humanity's forbearance snapped. The galaxy had watched, and now it was time for humanity to prove its place in the stars. After the summit on Orionis, the political tides had shifted. Humanity had won a battle for recognition, not just from the Union, but from the galaxy as a whole. But that victory was only the beginning. Juno Albright knew that the real work was just starting. As her ship, the Pride of Earth, glided through the cold expanse of space, she reflected on the past months. It had been a whirlwind of battles, diplomatic crises, and moments of triumph. But even as humanity's standing in the galaxy grew stronger, Juno couldn't shake the feeling that the challenges ahead would test humanity in ways they had never imagined. The political shift was clear. The old order was crumbling. The Union, despite its best efforts to maintain control, had realized that humanity's role was no longer just that of a supporter. Humanity had proven it could lead, and now it was time to decide how that leadership would shape the future. Back on Earth, the news of humanity's rise to prominence spread like wildfire. It wasn't just the soldiers who had fought in the battles who felt the weight of the moment. It was every human who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or told they weren't good enough. For the first time, humanity wasn't just surviving in the galaxy, they were shaping it. Juno stood on the command deck of the Pride of Earth, her eyes focused on the vastness of space ahead. She could feel the weight of the galaxy's gaze on her and on humanity. They were no longer the underdogs. They had become the symbol of resilience, of defiance, and of the willingness to fight for something greater than themselves. But that wasn't the end of their story. The galaxy was still full of challenges. New powers were rising, and older ones were showing their true colors. Juno knew that humanity's fight for respect and leadership wasn't over. It was just beginning. Juno's thoughts were interrupted by a soft chime. It was a message from the Union Council. She had expected this, but the sense of uncertainty that gripped her didn't fade. She took a deep breath and accepted the transmission. Chancellor Velthar's face appeared on the screen. His expression was as stern as ever, but this time there was a different air about him, one that wasn't filled with disdain or judgment. It was something more like acknowledgement. "Cadet Albright," he began, his tone less condescending than before. "You have proven yourself. Humanity has proven itself. There is no longer any question about your place in the galaxy." Juno's heart skipped. It wasn't often that Velthar acknowledged humanity in this way, but she knew there was more coming. "However," Velthar continued, "there is a new crisis. A rogue faction from one of the Union's allies has begun destabilizing neighboring systems. Their leader has claimed territory and resources, and the Union's intervention has been slow. We request your involvement in handling this threat." Juno stood tall, her voice steady. "What kind of threat are we dealing with, Chancellor?" Velthar's eyes darkened. "The faction, calling themselves the Sovereign Reclaimers, has begun to conquer systems at an alarming rate. The Union's response has been tepid, hesitant. They have made their moves in the shadows, using covert tactics to gain power. It is clear that they do not intend to follow the Union's rules." Juno's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. The Sovereign Reclaimers were not just a threat to the Union. They were a challenge to everything humanity had fought for. A challenge to the freedom that they had recently secured for the galaxy. "I understand," Juno said, her voice filled with determination. "We'll handle it, but know this, Chancellor. Humanity doesn't just follow orders. If we take this on, we will do it on our terms." Velthar studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I expected no less. Be aware, Cadet Albright, this will not be easy. You will not just be fighting for peace. You will be fighting for humanity's place in this galaxy." The transmission ended, and the weight of his words settled heavily on Juno's shoulders. She understood the implications of what was coming. The Sovereign Reclaimers weren't just another rebellion. They were a threat that could unravel everything humanity had worked to build. The next few days were filled with preparation. Juno gathered her team and briefed them on the situation. The Sovereign Reclaimers had gained a reputation for ruthlessness, and they weren't going to give up without a fight. But this time, humanity wasn't going in to play by the rules. They were going in to win. The task force assembled was a mix of Union and human forces, but Juno knew that humanity would have to lead this mission. She couldn't rely on the Union's typical slow-moving tactics. The galaxy needed to see that humanity could act decisively, that they could handle the responsibility of leadership without hesitation. As they made their way to the Sovereign Reclaimer's stronghold, Juno's mind raced. She had no illusions about what was at stake. The future of humanity's place in the galaxy hung in the balance. This would be their ultimate test. The battle for the Sovereign Reclaimer's stronghold was fierce. The Reclaimers fought with all their might, using guerrilla tactics and trying to break the resolve of the human-led task force. But Juno's leadership was unlike anything they had ever seen. Her tactics were bold, unorthodox, and effective. She coordinated with her team, making split-second decisions that saved lives and turned the tide of battle. In the end, humanity's determination triumphed. The sovereign reclaimers were defeated, their leader captured, and the threat to the galaxy neutralized. The Union was forced to recognize humanity's role in securing the peace once again, but the message was clear. Humanity had done more than fight. They had led. As the battle ended and the dust settled, Juno stood overlooking the captured stronghold, the weight of victory heavy on her shoulders. This was it. Humanity had secured its place in the galaxy. No longer just a tool or an afterthought, they were leaders in their own right. The galaxy would never forget the day humanity's forbearance snapped. And now, as Juno looked out at the stars, she knew that the future of the galaxy was no longer in the hands of the old powers. It was in humanity's hands, and they would shape it, for better or worse.